A massive home renovation for elder care? $30,000? What are you talking about? Huh? That's my wife's parents' house, right? A phone call from a man claiming to be my estranged sister-in-law's husband. Considering how the conversation isn't making any sense, it seems like my sister-in-law is up to something. My name is Martha, a 56-year-old stay-at-home wife. I have a son and a daughter, both of whom are adults and have moved out of the house. Now I live with my husband and in-laws, just the four of us. My relationship with my in-laws is good, which I appreciate because I lost my own parents early in life. My husband and I have been enjoying our lives after being freed from child-rearing responsibilities. When we got married, it was understood that we would eventually live with my husband's parents, but my mother-in-law, who had suffered in her relationship with her own mother-in-law, had our house rebuilt into a two-family home for our sake. Even though we live together, we each have our own private space. Maybe that's why our relationship has been so good. During the day, my husband is still working, so I often spend time with my in-laws. That day, as my father-in-law was busy with farm work, I was preparing lunch in the kitchen, planning for us to eat together outside. Then a call came from one of my father-in-law's farming friends, telling us that he had fallen and broken a bone. He had already been taken to the family doctor in a pickup truck. My mother-in-law and I left the food and rushed to the hospital. When we arrived, emergency surgery was underway. My father-in-law seemed healthy, but he was in his 80s and recovering from a fracture would be tough. We were told to be prepared for the worst, like needing a wheelchair. That's what they were talking about. As long as he's alive, that's enough. I will be his legs. We waited anxiously for the surgery to end with prayers in our hearts. By the time my husband finished work and arrived, the surgery was over, and the three of us were relieved to see my father-in-law sleeping in his hospital room without any serious complications. We decided to support my father-in-law together from now on, but our prayers were in vain, and my father-in-law passed away suddenly 1 month later. His age had weakened his physical strength and immunity, and he had contracted an infection after the surgery. Many of his friends, relatives, and acquaintances were also elderly, so informing them about the wake and the funeral would only be upsetting to them. The three of us discussed it and decided on a family funeral. However, even a family funeral didn't resolve all the issues. What about my sister-in-law? I asked. My mother-in-law and husband both made visibly unapproving faces, probably recalling my sister-in-law's marriage turmoil. My in-laws had strongly opposed her marriage. My husband wasn't as opposed as them, but he couldn't purely be happy about it either. As a result, their relationship became strained and distant. Still, she was their biological daughter. Wouldn't it be okay for her to be present at the final farewell? They agreed that if we could get in touch with her, it would be fine. But we couldn't reach her at the contact information we had, and the funeral proceeded without her. It's just how things are with her. It's fate. Don't worry about it, Martha. On our way back from the crematorium to the house with my father-in-law's ashes, my mother-in-law gently patted my shoulder and reassured me. My father-in-law's sudden passing took us all by surprise. Without any mental preparation, we hurriedly went through the funeral and cremation. We clasped our hands over my father-in-law's ashes, lit incense, and spent the following days in a state of listlessness. It's more bearable when my husband is around. We can talk to each other. But when my husband goes to work, I can't stand being alone in the quiet room. So I head to my mother-in-law's room. I know she is feeling even more pain and sadness than I am. After all, she suddenly lost the husband she had been with for so many years. Even if it is just a facade, I try to be cheerful around her. However, my mother-in-law was much more accepting of reality than I thought. I was planning to stay like this until the 49th day, but... Yes, we can sort through his belongings later. But you know, I'm already over 80. You look so young for your 80, mother-in-law. Not having been sick often, she would say that the only time she was hospitalized was for childbirth. In other words, she was directly telling us that she's healthy enough for us not to worry about her. You're so kind, Martha. But while I can still move around, I'd like to sort through my things, including his. I understand the feeling of not wanting someone else to go through the important memories, like my father-in-law's belongings. Understood. Just let me know if you need any help. With that, she immediately asked me to help her take down items that were too high for her to reach. As we pulled out old photos of my father-in-law, my mother-in-law happily reminisced about their younger days, sharing stories about their travels and adventures. I listened intently, nodding along, when the phone rang. My mother-in-law doesn't have a smartphone, so the landline is her main means of communication. I wonder who that is. There were only a handful of people who would call, and they were all close friends who knew our situation. I thought they would avoid calling if they knew, but it might be an emergency. I'll answer it. It was better for me to move rather than make my mother-in-law, who had been talking about how sitting and standing were becoming difficult, get up. I quickly picked up the receiver near the entrance, and a man's voice I didn't recognize greeted me. He introduced himself as my sister-in-law's husband, speaking very politely. However, I had never met him before. I didn't know if he really was who he claimed to be. As I listened, wondering if this was some new scam targeting elderly people, he said, "I want to talk to you about the home renovation for caregiving. My father-in-law had already passed away. Why bring up caregiving renovations now? Did he mistake my mother-in-law? No, she wasn't in need of that level of care. Excuse me, but are you sure you have the right house? This is my wife's family home, right?" The man claiming to be my sister-in-law's husband mentioned her maiden name. Indeed, the maiden name matched my husband's family, and there was no mistake that this was their home. Moreover, the name matched my sister-in-law's. It is true that the woman you mention is my husband's sister. Thank goodness. Thank you for believing me. With all the trouble our marriage has caused, I was worried I had made a bad impression again. I don't know the reason why my in-laws so strongly opposed my sister-in-law's marriage. However, I don't get a bad impression from this man at all. On the contrary, he seems very humble and sincere. According to my brother-in-law, he heard that the cost of caregiving renovation would be around $30,000. He wants to do his best to make up for the inconvenience he has caused. He fully intends to pay the $30,000 and is preparing it. However, he just can't get the money ready by the deadline. His call was to ask if we could possibly wait and extend the payment deadline. It's awkward to let him explain everything before saying this, but since he spoke with such passion, I failed to convey the truth. Thank you for your politeness. So, about the extension. Please, wait a moment. When did you hear about the caregiving renovation? My father-in-law was very healthy and was working in agriculture until recently. So the need for caregiving, it didn't exist at all. It didn't? Wait, past tense? Yes, my father-in-law passed away. We just finished his funeral and cremation the other day. I see. Well... I could picture him panicking on the other end of the phone. He must be confused by the difference between what his wife told him and the truth I just shared. It just didn't make sense to him. He slowly told me that he had caused a lot of trouble for my in-laws when they got married. He had heard from his wife that her father needed care and he intended to provide financial assistance as an apology for the trouble he had caused. He told me all this. Feeling that he was being honest, I asked him how the story of my father-in-law needing care came up. It had come up a few years ago. At first, he seemed to be sending a fixed amount every month as a contribution to caregiving expenses. However, it was clear neither my father-in-law nor mother-in-law had heard of such a thing. If they had known, my mother-in-law would have invited him to the funeral. He said, "Her mother was grateful and that it helped, so I thought I was slowly being forgiven." "If you were being forgiven, wouldn't she talk to you?" "That's true." Moreover, the amount of money sent each year seemed to be increasing. He had been sending more money every month, assuming we had asked for additional support, something we had no recollection of. "So none of that money has reached you." When I agreed, I could picture him getting extremely upset. It was hard for me to convey the information as well. As I was listening, I thought that maybe my sister-in-law, I couldn't quite say "you're being scammed," but he said, "You don't have to be considerate. I'm being scammed, aren't I?" I couldn't say yes or no, so I remained silent. He probably took my silence as affirmation. He asked what he should do, assuming he was being scammed. Although it wasn't my place to answer that question, I just couldn't leave my sister-in-law, my husband's sister, alone, even though we were estranged. I told him we would discuss the matter and contact him later, and that was it for today. When I returned to my mother-in-law, she said, "That was a long call. Was it a pushy salesperson? You should just hang up on those." She seemed to think it was a persistent sales call. No, it was a man claiming to be my sister-in-law's husband. So I relayed the content of the phone call to my mother-in-law. She was trembling with anger even while listening, and her anger exploded even more after hearing everything. What kind of person is she, using her father as an excuse to ask her husband for money? Apparently, my sister-in-law has always been reckless with money. Owning expensive branded items she couldn't afford with her allowance or part-time job earnings, her actions were suspicious. When she wanted to get married, her partner was a man with a considerably high income who had an incomparable amount of pre-existing wealth, which led her parents to strongly oppose the marriage. The opposition wasn't for my sister-in-law's sake, but for her partner. We then decided to wait at the culprit's house, with her husband for her to return home. I can't remember the last time I saw my sister-in-law. When she decided to date her then-boyfriend with the intention of getting married, she introduced him to her parents and brother. There was a commotion about my sister-in-law's marriage, but since I was not yet related to my in-laws, I did not attend. So this would be my first time meeting my sister-in-law's husband. As I had perceived over the phone, he seemed to be a sincere person with a pleasant demeanor. I had heard he had high income, but he didn't seem to be living lavishly. He seemed to be trying to live a modest life, but if one of the reasons for this was my sister-in-law's lies, it must be a complicated set of emotions. Reuniting with my sister-in-law after several decades, my sister-in-law, who would never have expected her mother to be there at her home, was so surprised that her eyes widened as she stood frozen. The impression of my sister-in-law that I remember was one of someone who liked flashy things, but the sister-in-law in front of me was flashy to the point of being gaudy and lacking any sense of style, which was painful to watch. The three of us had agreed beforehand that we would go along with my sister-in-law's story at first. We decided not to touch upon the fact that she was lying. "It's been a while. I'm glad to see you're doing well." When my sister-in-law was suddenly spoken to with kind words, she stammered while responding to her mother. She probably thought her lies had been exposed and she was going to be yelled at, but she seemed confused by the unexpected kindness. "I wanted to see your face after all this time. Have you been doing well?" We didn't tell her the truth about her father's passing and maintained the pretense that he was still alive. I also apologized for not having been in touch and gave a suitable greeting. My sister-in-law said humbly that she was glad her mother seemed well and that she had been worried about her. However, she did not mention her father. It would be terrible if the conversation turned to her father and the topic of caregiving expenses slipped out of my husband's mouth. It seemed that my husband and she had met beforehand, but apparently her lies had not been exposed. She probably thought she could get away with it and not get caught. "Your mom is happy. It seems that you two are getting along well as a couple." My mother-in-law said she was happy to have a good daughter and hoped that my sister-in-law would have a change of heart and start repaying her husband little by little. The plan was to shower her with praise in the hope of changing her ways. Somehow, my sister-in-law got carried away and told my mother-in-law that she would support her if she ever needed caregiving, and even went so far as to say not to worry about money. It's amazing she could say such things in front of her husband who had been supporting her out of good intentions. I felt so sorry for her husband listening to all this. We conveyed our gratitude and left that day. From her behavior, it seemed likely that my sister-in-law had been using the money she asked for herself. Not knowing what she'd spent the sudden large sum of $30,000 on, we decided to have a private investigator look into her finances. The monthly caregiving funds of several $1,000s were indeed being used for her own benefit. However, it turned out that she was also heavily involved with a favorite host at a club, supporting him in various ways to make him number one. She'd been spending lavishly, buying expensive bottles and racking up debt she couldn't pay off each month. The host was being strictly pursued for the unpaid bills, which amounted to $30,000. Upon learning this, my sister-in-law's husband was furious and decided he couldn't overlook it any longer. He arranged everything while she was on a trip with her favorite host. Unaware of all this, my sister-in-law returned home after a few days to find her house completely empty, with not a single piece of furniture or personal item left behind. Panicking, she tried to contact her husband but couldn't get through, so she called me. At first, she was hysterical, but when I asked her, "How was your trip with your favorite host?" she immediately quieted down. She couldn't ask how I knew about it, since that would be admitting to her actions. Now it was my turn to reveal everything without giving her any room for rebuttal. "I can't believe you thought you weren't caught and took advantage of the situation. You betrayed your mother, your husband, and I don't think anyone will want to help you anymore." I also told her that the father-in-law she used as an excuse had passed away. It was not her fault for not knowing he had died, but using her father's care as a reason to ask for money was wrong. I informed her that her ex-husband knew the truth as well, and realizing she had been abandoned, she let out a scream like a madwoman over the phone. Her ex-husband didn't want to speak to her, and not wanting to burden my elderly mother-in-law any further, I offered to be the go-between with my sister-in-law. She continued to make a fuss over the phone. In a way, she was a pitiable person, not even knowing her father had passed away and using him as an excuse. She might regret it, but it's too late now. I conveyed one last message to her. "Your ex-husband said he's going to demand full payment for the money you gave to the host. You'll have to figure out how to pay off the $30,000 debt yourself." Later, she received paperwork from a lawyer. She asked to talk to her husband, but he never agreed. He was furious and couldn't stand the thought of his ex-wife even for the sake of legal procedures. Without any compromise, my sister-in-law was forced to live a frugal life while working. Of course, she couldn't afford to splurge at the host club anymore, and her favorite host stopped paying attention to her, leaving her with nothing but the huge debt she had accumulated. Occasionally, intimidating debt collectors would come by. Being naturally timid, my sister-in-law lived in constant fear of the lawyer's notices and the debt collector's visits. As for the three of us, we returned to our normal lives. It still took some time to sort through my father-in-law's belongings, but we decided to live on, including his share, as a family. Lately, my mother-in-law has started showing signs of decline, and I have a feeling the day she'll need caregiving might be close. Since we couldn't do anything for my father-in-law, my husband and I agreed to do our best for my mother-in-law.